Do you think you can define these 6 words? Let's take a second and see. What do you think acapella means? How about and curried? Asshole? Blame storming? How about a C note or cyber slacking? How many did you automatically recognize? Here are the definitions. Acapella, singing badly while listening to music through headphones. And curried, being fired unexpectedly and or without cause. Asshole, an individual who asks ridiculous, obnoxious, or irrelevant questions. This is often chronic behavior. Blame storming, usually in a business setting, the act of attempting to identify who is to blame for a failure or problem, rather than trying to brainstorm a solution. C note, a $100 bill, where C stands for centum, the Latin word for 100. Cyber slacking, using one's employer's internet and email for personal activities during work. So, how did you do? Welcome to our lecture on symbolic interactionism. Today we will explain the fundamentals of the theory, explore the criticisms of the theory, and look at how it can be applied in everyday life. George Herbert Mead was a philosophy professor at the University of Chicago during the first third of the 20th century. He is known as the father of symbolic interactionism theory, even though he died before it could be published. After Mead died in 1934, his students wrote up his ideas in Mind, Self, and Society. Mead is one of several scholars in sociology, psychology, and communication who study the world from this viewpoint. He thought that the true test of any theory is whether or not it is useful in solving complex social problems, and he felt that symbolic interactionism could do just that. He claimed that most human activity that people can engage in, the thing that makes us human, is talking to each other. Remembering from last week that a symbol is an abstract and arbitrary stimuli to which meaning is applied, we can examine the 3 core principles of symbolic interactionism. First, that meaning is the construction of social reality. Second, that language is the source of meaning. And third, that thought is taking the role of the other and reflecting. Humans act toward people or things on the basis of the meanings they assign to those people or things. The construction of social reality refers to our perceptions, or how we interpret the things around us. The second premise is that meaning arises out of the social interaction that people have with each other. Meaning is not inherent in objects. Meaning is negotiated through the use of language, hence the term symbolic interactionism. Mead believed that symbolic naming is the basis for society. Let's take the word sun. When I say the word sun, it doesn't have any inherent meaning. It means a ball of gas in the sky because we interpret it to mean that. The letter S-U-N, when brought together, become the word because we all agree that it should mean sun, and that word sun refers to the star in our solar system. For Mead, knowing and naming are closely linked together. Symbolic interaction is not just a means for intelligent expression, it's also the way we learn to interpret the world. The words we use have default assumptions. We usually don't consciously think about our mental jumps to the default. For example, if I say, the doctor was in, people often picture a man in scrubs. This is a default image in our mind based on symbols and perceptions. We could just as easily think of a woman in a lab coat. Sometimes we have to question our default assumptions to have a more accurate and unbiased interpretation of the world. That's one reason this theory matters. It helps us understand how the meanings we put on symbols shape our perceptions of how the world actually is. The third premise is that an individual's interpretation of symbols is modified by his or her thought processes. Thinking is described as an inner conversation called minding. Minding is reflecting, figuring out your next move, anticipating, testing alternatives. Mead's greatest contribution to our understanding of the way we think is his notion that human beings have the unique capacity to take the role of the other. We can try to put ourselves in the place of another person and think from outside our own perspective. Taking the role of the other allows us to see ourselves through meaning, interpreting the world, language, social interaction, and thought, role-taking. We arrive at the self, a reflection in a looking glass. We see ourselves not by introspection, but by taking the role of the other and imagining how we look to another person. We call this the looking glass self. The concept of the looking glass self comes from a poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Is to his friend a looking glass, reflects his figure that doth pass. In other words, our self-concept derives from talk. One has to be a member of a community before consciousness of self sets in. The self changes with each interaction. For example, if you woke up today feeling unfit or sloppy, but someone compliments you on your appearance, that interchange changes yourself by virtue of the looking glass of another person's perspective. Perhaps you're not as sloppy or unfit as you thought you were. This highlights just how powerful our words can be to other people in impacting their sense of self. The I is a spontaneous driving force. We can't observe it. The me is viewed as an object, something we can see and reflect on. The I of this moment is present in the me of the next moment. In this way, self consists of I and me, the spontaneous driving force combining with our view of ourself as an object. The picture we get from the many looking glass reflections is called the generalized other. It is the me. The me is formed through symbolic interactions with others. So the me is the community within the person. The generalized other forms through reflecting on ourselves in our interactions. The majority of interactionist research uses qualitative research methods, like participant observation, to study social interaction and individual selves. As a result, some theorists have a problem with symbolic interaction theory due to its lack of testability. Mead's distrust of data and surveys make it more subjective. Some critics also find the symbolic interactionist framework too broad and general when they're seeking specific theories. So what does this theory do for us as students of communication? How can it be applied to help us solve real-world problems? First, we need to recognize that each of us has a significant impact on how others view themselves. Consider in your mind some of the terrible slurs that society has created. I won't say any of them here, but they can do a great deal of harm. One way of understanding that harm is through symbolic interactionism. Name-calling can be devastating because insults force us to view ourselves in a warped mirror or bring negative things into our view of ourselves. The ugly images aren't easily dismissed from our mind and can attach themselves to our sense of who we are. If you've ever had someone call you a name, you know how difficult it can be to just move on. The viewpoint of symbolic interactionism can be applied to the use of social media like Facebook and Instagram. Instagram is known to be the worst social media site for self-esteem. But why? Using the theory of symbolic interactionism, we can see how a person's identity is presented and created on social media. You can boast and humble brag through a newsfeed, demonstrating success, noting milestones like jobs or relationships, and generally creating your own identity. But you might also see that identity reflected back to you in the comments of others. So those comments could be very helpful or very hurtful in terms of creating your personal identity. Hopefully this has given you a basic understanding of symbolic interactionism and its ideas about how we create meaning and our sense of self. We've also covered some criticisms of the theory and ways that it can apply in our daily lives. Next time you're logging in online or listening to a reality show in which people hurl insults, hopefully you will consider how these interactions and symbols are changing the way people live in the world.